Today, we're looking at Birmingham Pen Company's George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson. Hi, I'm Adam, and I'm an ink guy. I get inks, test them, and share the results with you. Now, Birmingham Pen Company's George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson is kind of a reddish-brown color, although when very wet looks kind of black. That makes it a little interesting. To make sure I have a range of experience with this ink, I do the writing samples. I then put the ink into a different pen for a day. I then put it into a Delight Alpha with a medium nib to take my notes for this video. Now before we look at the writing samples, let's look at the sciencey bits. Up first is the chromatography, and I agree with Vita that I've learned a lot by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. I put a line of ink down and immediately dunk it into water for 10 to 15 seconds. And what we see is it's got this really nice green across the bottom, a purple up into a red. Now, part of me wonders if that purple is some of the joining of colors, but I don't think so. I think it is actually a color in the mix of this ink. The one on the right I let dry for 10 minutes before I dunk it into water. And this is part of the reason that I think it's a color in the mix, not from the inks coming together. That green is very permanent across the bottom. It really stays in place. Now we see the green move up, we see some of that purple again, and then we see very distinctly the red at the top, which makes me feel that red would go away without a problem. Why I think that purple is not a part, or is a part of mixing this ink? You don't normally mix green and red to make purple. You mix green and red to make brown. But this is a red-brown. And that purple's in there, which gives it that very dark depth of color. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it might be to clean from your pens. Now I let the smear dry for 3 days before testing it. Looking at the highlighter, it basically seems to do pretty good. There is some smudging about, there is some spread and tiny little bits of feathering, but all of the writing is clearly readable, which makes me feel confident using this ink in a note-taking situation. Looking at water, it reactivates and lifts very little of this ink. Very, very little. I don't think it was really lifting the ink so much as that was the ink that was on top of ink, if that makes sense. Pen Flush did much more than the water, but not a lot to remove this ink. We see a lot of it going away, leaving some of that green behind down below, but man, that's a lot left behind. This ink really is quite resistant. And when you look at bleach, while bleach is completely removing most all of the ink, we get left with some brown staining on the paper. That means test this in an inexpensive pen before you go to your expensive pens. Just as a precaution, I don't know that this would stain your pen. I haven't had issues with that. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't. So be willing to check on your own. For the inks I've tested, I've found an average viscosity of 2.5, with the realm of normal being from 2.1 to 2.9. Birmingham Pen Company's George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson has a viscosity of 2.92, which makes it just barely a drier ink. To find my average dry times, I average my writing samples done with the extra fine and medium nib on Clairefontaine, Tomoe River, and Rhodia paper. For the inks I've tested, I've found an average dry time of 17 seconds, with the realm of normal being from 13 to 21 seconds. Birmingham Pen Company's George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson has an average dry time of 10 seconds. Man, that's fast. Now, let's look at the writing samples. I picked this ink up in sample form. To keep my writing samples consistent, I use a Jinhao 159 with a Goulet 1.1 stub, a Jinhao X450 with a Goulet medium, and a Jinhao X750 with a Goulet extra fine. These samples, they're messy. You will get this all over your hands, getting that plastic thing out. I don't like these samples. They're a pain in the neck. Let's take a look at some Clairefontaine. We get no bleeding, no ghosting. The 1.1 has no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade. It's not crimson. The extra fine has no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. It does offer some light shading where it gets a little bit darker in some areas, like on the HE of the and the CK of quick. The B starts darker and gets, or the B in brown starts darker and then it gets lighter. So it does offer some shading with the extra fine. It took 6 seconds to dry. The medium, a noticeably darker tone. No feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. No shading, 9 seconds to dry. The scrubby of the extra fine shows us a little bit of color variation. We did get a little bit of color variation. The medium shows us none. We got none. But you could recover this if you smeared it while you were writing. Tomoe River, no bleeding. Yes, it has ghosting. The 1.1, which I didn't write in 1.1, that's the medium. I must have made, no, that's the extra fine. I must have made a mistake. So I'm going to skip it, go to the extra fine. The extra fine has no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade at all. And it took 9 seconds to dry. Excuse me, 9 seconds to dry. The medium had no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade. It's a noticeably darker tone, but it took 15 seconds to dry. The extra fine and the medium scrubby both showed no color variation. We didn't get any color variation. And the smear test, I don't believe you could recover this if you smeared when you were writing. So Rhodia. Rhodia gives us no bleeding, no ghosting. The 1.1, which I must have just really screwed up. I did. There's no 1.1 in these samples at all. So we're going to skip the 1.1 stuff. The extra fine. No feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. Yes, we do get some color variation, and we do get to see some red undertones here. Color variation occurs more word to word than it does within the word. Quick looks a tone or two darker than over. The looks way dark, even next to quick. So we get some color variation that occurs word to word, not so much within the word. It took 7 seconds to dry. Very noticeably darker tone with the medium. No feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, and no shading. 12 seconds to dry. Now when we look at the scrubbies, the extra fine shows us a lot more color variation than we actually got, although we did get some. The medium shows us none. We didn't get any. The smear test, you could recover this if you smeared it while you were writing. Apica paper, one of my favorites. It does really spectacular. It has no bleeding, no ghosting. The extra fine. No feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. It really brought out the shade in this ink. It allowed in quick it to start darker, get lighter, and get very dark. In the, it started very light and it worked its way to very dark. Dog started darker and got much lighter. The word over is much lighter than like the right side of the. So we get a lot of very nice color variation on the extra fine. It only took 4 seconds to dry. The medium, a noticeably darker tone with no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, no shade. 6 seconds to dry. The scrubby of the extra fine shows us a bunch of color variation. The scrubby of the medium shows us none. And that's exactly what we got in the writing samples. The smear test, I believe you could recover this if you did smear it. Tracing paper. Just because it's not the last one, I need a backer. We get no bleeding. Of course we have ghosting. It's tracing paper. It's just fun to play with ink in art sometimes. The extra fine has no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. We do see color variation in here. We've seen that the tracing paper really does bring out that color variation in inks a lot. So when I say it brings out the color variation a lot, when we only get a little bit here, the K is a little darker than the C, H is a little darker than the T, the LA is a little darker than the Z, which is a little darker than the Y. It really brings out the color variation, and it's not super obvious here. 7 seconds to dry. The medium, a noticeably darker tone with, there's feathering. There is some feathering. It's very light feathering all over. It's not a problem. This is not a note-taking type paper. I don't think if you had to work with this, it would be the end of the world, although in art, that would probably drive you nuts. 11 seconds to dry. I'm sorry, no halo, sheen, or shade, and 11 seconds to dry. The extra fine shows us some color variation. We did get a little bit of color variation. The medium shows us none. We didn't get any. The scrubby says you could probably recover it. Probably. So Franklin Christoph paper. Gives us no bleeding, no ghosting, the extra fine. There is some spread. There is no feathering. There's no halo, no sheen, and no shade in the writing. 4 seconds to dry. The medium, noticeably, very noticeably, it's like black here. Darker tone. There's a little bit of spread. There's no feathering. There's no halo, no sheen, and no shade. It only took 7 seconds to dry. The scrubby of both show us no color variation. The smear test says we could probably recover it if we did smear while we were writing. And that is all that I have for the writing sample. Instead of finding inks that look like Birmingham Pen Company's George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson, I would prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Now, being a very dark brown red, I wanted a vivid color to go with it. And I chose Robert Oster's Blue Lagoon because I felt that it would really stand out and make this ink look even darker with that bright blue with it. Before I give my opinion on this ink, I would ask, if you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And if it's your first time here, I would invite you to subscribe. So what do I think about Birmingham Pen Company's George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson? Nothing of this ink says crimson to me, except a little bit in the chromatography where it was towards the top. Now that aside, the color does look like the carbon buildup that we sometimes see inside carburetors. And it's alternator crimson. In that way, it's very good. But this particular color is very dull and uninteresting to me. I don't think it's bad. It just makes me, I'd never looked at the carbon buildup inside and been like, oh yeah, I want an ink that looks like that. But that's me. Thanks for watching.